Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I am an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I'm going to have a conversation with my great friend Trent. Hello, Trent.
Hi everybody, this is your old friend Chen. I'm a cultural historian, and I recently relocated to Kansas City, Missouri. So I'm literally in the heart of America now. But great to be with you all today.
Yes. In the next two episodes, we basically conclude what we have started to work on in the past few episodes. We've been working on John Odling-Smee's book on niche construction, how life contributes to its own evolution. John Odling-Smee, as you know by now, by following the episodes that we have covered, is he's actually the person who coined the term niche construction, and not only used it in the ecological context, but the main argument of the book actually is that niche construction is an important part of evolutionary process, which is most of the time is reduced to population genetics. Now, in this episode, what we want to do in this episode and next episode, we are going to start with a summary of what we have talked about, some of the main points that Odling-Smee brings up, and how he positions himself within the history of evolutionary biology, um, and also how some of the points that he makes are directly relevant to our broader intellectual interests and the concepts that we are investigating from very different angles from the beginning of Versucha and how he gets connected to that trajectory in general. And we will conclude this episode with our first round of um, criticisms, you can call them, more like a critical engagement with Odling-Smee and the shortcomings of his account, insofar as we are considering our projects are intertwined with him, and how niche construction will be located intellectually in that space. Trent, so far, anything?
So far so good. Yes, it's
All right.
good. Just remind us that what we here and doing what we're doing.
Yes. So I think there are a couple of like levels in Odling-Smee's point that are both the most important of his points and also most exciting aspects of his work. He has a very specific emphasis on, because the broader context for Odling-Smee, as I said, is that he thinks there is something lacking in what he calls the standard evolutionary theory. But he's not trying to reject the standard evolutionary theory. He wants to say that there is something missing in it. And what is basically missing is understanding what life really is. And understanding what life really is means also understanding how life survives, which in very important ways gets connected to the whole process of evolution. But oddly, Smith's point is that if you don't understand what it takes for a living being to maintain a living being, your view of how that life evolves is gonna fall on its own terms. Or it's not going to be comprehensive enough to give you the true causal narrative that decides what a living being not only is, but what it becomes. So the point that Aldous-Smee, in terms of insofar as life is concerned, emphasizes on is that there are two layers to life: energy and information. Basically, you need to maintain a certain type of energy um, equation. And to maintain that energy equation, you need information. What that means in more physical terms is that every living entity is a far from equilibrium thermodynamic system. It is locally resisting entropy, locally resisting dissipation, And physically speaking, one needs to end one, meaning the entity, requires to have an intake and outtake of energy to maintain this. Like, like in a kind of a like basic example that he uses in like the beginning chapters is to think about it in the way that we think about, like, I believe it is in the book, or it's like of a common parallel or example that is used in this context, which is like a drop of ink into water, right? If you put the drop of ink into water, it dissipates and it goes like as far as it could, and it occupies the whole space. Now, if you want to drop a drop of ink into water and that drop of ink remaining exactly where it is, you can imagine that we need to spend energy to accomplish that. That's what living beings are about. Now, there are like kind of coherent patterns that emerge in life. There are coherent patterns that emerge outside of life, right? There are abiotic systems in the world that somehow maintain themselves. The difference between life and those systems is that life is intertwined with information inheritance. It's not that it is just surviving now, but it can in different ways replicate itself, and through that replication also pass some information to the replica. And this replication could be like asexual, of course, in the very beginning of it, and it could becomes more complicated. But the logic of it doesn't change. The logic of it is the same, and the idea is rather simple. If you have two systems of this kind that happen to be able to maintain themselves and happen to create something like themselves, like, or just replicate themselves in a very kind of even mechanical way, let's say. If we have two parallel stories of like the first replica does not have the elements that helped the first one to survive in it, and there is another replica that has those elements that helped the first one survive, basically a way to manipulate the energy influx. The one that has that basic information is the one that is going to survive. And this just keeps going. The entities that happen to have the information that helps effectively manage the input output of energy are the ones that are going to survive. Okay. And that's the story of life. The thing is that when we start now thinking about evolution of life in the context of population genetics, we seem to just get obsessed about the information part. That this is all about information inheritance. This is about selective pressure on different information, like units, right? Which could be RNA, it could be DNA. It's not even about like the phenotypic expression of that gene, what Richard Dawkins has called like the selfish gene. It's not just, that's just kind of that survival of that phenotype is ultimately just about the survival of that gene that was responsible for it. And the genes are, coded information, and that's the story of evolution, right? The story of evolution is the story of which genes survive. The genes survive that manage to get out of the selection pressure that is put on them, and are able to replicate themselves. And that's just it. That's the end of that story. So when we're thinking about adaptation, that adaptation does not have any role for agency, right? It's not like that the gene for breaking out sugar using a specific enzyme is like has a mind that it was just like, oh, okay, this is a good way to go about this. No, it just like happened to be the one that did this, and it happens to be the one that survived. Happens to be the one that had the opportunity to replicate, and that's the end of that story. So when we're thinking about adaptation, even when we are thinking about adaptation at the level of multicellular like mammals, ultimately to understand the real biology of adaptation, we need to go at the genetic level and just see like what kind of manipulation exists at that level that ends up being like translated into this monkey reaches out and gets this pear out of like this tree and like eats it. But like the point is not about that. It's about all of those things, that all of those genes that were responsible for that. That you have to be able to sense certain things. That you have to be able to the genes to develop specific cognitive abilities to be able to visually detect pair. What matters is that those genes will survive through the body of that organism. And that's all there is in the story of adaptation. The monkey that is just not able to see the pear or is not able to digest it or is not able to take it out of the tree or anything, any combination of that, it just means the genes that the monkey had that made it impossible for it to do that are also not going to pass generationally. The whole point of introducing the energy element for Odling-Smee is to challenge this view. There is agency involved in the story of adaptation, and there is evolution beyond population genetics. And the way that that works out is through niche construction. Basically, Odling-Smee wants to say that there are two ways that we can think about how an organism adapted to its environment, which ultimately means how an organism survived. One is it had like a set of like genetic structure that immediately got into like contact with the environment, and that gene was like, let's say, having a certain height or like being pre-exposed to be tall if you eat protein, right? And if being tall meant something positive in that environment, um, that gene survives, and that just goes on. That information gets inherited, that information gets replicated, so on and so forth. But that's not the only way. There's another way. Say that like a monkey um, happens to not have, or a troop of monkeys happen to not have the gene for being tall amongst their companions, which means that under normal conditions, you know, other alpha male monkeys will beat the crap out of them, and they will like lose that competitive like fight, and they will have a much harder time to survive and reproduce. Okay, but if that troop of monkey ends up being able to change their environment in a way that the tall element, the gene and the phenotypic expression of the gene as like being tall, not being important anymore, that's another way to survive, right? If there is the, for instance, a cognitive capacity for the monkey to like be like develop that troop of monkeys develop a very very like basic defensive thing by like I don't know, sharpening like a branch or using branches in a certain way or using it like a moving certain like element, like being able to throw a stone, right? Learning how to use basic tools. Then that story is different now. It's not that like the story was just like, okay, predetermined. The environment is fixed. The environment is we will prioritize taller monkeys. Yes, it did if everything remained the same. But if the monkeys, that troop of monkeys changed that scenario, changed the environment by manipulating the environment, the story is not the same, right? And all these elements that end up being crafted by different organisms as a matter to survive by other means, not survive because they have the gene that is perfectly matched with the environment, but by changing the environment, that whatever other genes they have is now suitable to the environment. In other words, by changing what is the selection pressure within an environment through changing it, that's evolutionary relevant, right? So if you want to get to know that why, like after a while, the gene that determined the height of monkeys, a specific species of monkeys, is relaxed, so to speak. That it's not important. Like given that it doesn't hit a specific extremes, it's just fine whatever height you are. If you want to understand how that evolutionary fact happened, we need to go back and see like what kind of practices data species have developed, that maybe they now have a specific tool capacity that, you know, broad shoulders or like tall posture is not really doing that much. Like in contrast to that, there might be more selective pressure on certain type of cognitive ability, or being able to like, manipulate the stones in your environment so that they could become tools, defensive tools, or like a sort of some sort of a little like piece of space that you can protect. um, so this is just like a rant. Like I don't even know like if that is has any root in reality as an actual example, but that's a hypothetical example. So when we think of these types of practices, we're thinking about also like things that are more familiar, which is like, the dam building of beavers, but also like Odling-Smee thinks that something like photosynthesis, some bacteria being able to manipulate and change in a way that they can use like energy of the sun, that is also niche construction. And of course, human beings like creating like bureaucracy is niche construction, right? If you have a functioning bureaucracy at like the state level, then certain selective pressures will be off that genetic pool and other selective pressures are introduced, as opposed to if you are in a failed state and you need to like, fight for every like meal that you have, then like it's a very different type of selective pressure. But they are different because not because just like there are genes and the genes are just like replying to the environment that they have in some sort of an automatic mechanical way, but because one failed to create a niche and the other managed to create a niche, and then therefore their evolutionary story is different trend.
Yes, I have 3 points to add. It was a really helpful and informative summary of his main arguments. First, the thing I think I want to emphasize is for Odling-Smee, the focus of evolutionary study or theory is now switching from individual species, specific genetic pool or composition towards a organism environment niche relationship. So natural selection works not just by comparing the genetic pool of one species that was group individual member with another, but rather how well suited that organism versus the environment relationship really worked at a given moment. Second thing I want to emphasize is relate to the second point in the slide is the concept of agency. I think we can be slightly more perhaps concrete that what kind of agencies to emphasize. One very important type of agency that is completely ignored in standard evolutionary theory according to Odling-Smee is that individual learning. that at the moment of your conception, basically, your position in this um, evolutionary game or calculation according to the standard evolution theory has already been given. Your significance is preset. But Olin means that by introducing niche construction, you could experiment with the new ways of changing the environment and um, introducing new selective pressure or elevating existing ones to change the game, basically. So individual effort absolutely matters in the whole big picture of evolution, which I think is something the agency of individual, the agency of action or learning, the individual life history matters more in his new niche construction theory. A third point I want to add is to kind of I think you are talking when you're giving examples about like a troop of monkeys, like inventing new. You're already assuming listeners have been following the whole series. I think at one point need to be emphasized here is that knowledge of using a tool and changing the whole parameter of mate selecting everything is not genetically transmitted, which is a point that Odling-Smee would emphasize. So we have alternative inheritance models that are not reducible to like a genetic based transmission, yet they are equally important for determining what kind of individuals will successfully reproduce and have their like whatever genes um, transmitted. So genes we cannot just understand the distribution of genetic genotypes by looking at the genotypes themselves. We must look into the actualized the behaviors and the communications that enable the transmission of the genes. So unlike traditional model of standard evolutionary theory, we cannot take genes as both the beginning and the end of evolutionary process. We must look at other parameters that are involved for genes to be alive, to maintain that thermodynamic, that energy flow, and also to take into consideration of how individual organisms carrying their genetic composition interacted with their environment to deal with this selective pressure. So all those factors must be added to the pre-existing standard evolutionary theory. So I just wanted to concur with you that for Odling-Smee, that his niche construction theory is not to dismiss, is not designed to dismiss the standard evolutionary population genetics, but to supplement it by pointing out missing elements in the standard model. Yes, that's my
To follow up on that on just one point, and then we can move on to the criticism because you mentioned something very important. Is that uh, the way that I suggest it, it might have been suggested or interpreted from what I suggested that I meant that the only thing that Odling-Smee wants to do is to say that, hey, like if you remember the energy part of the equation, like we find niche construction. But like the point, as you mentioned, is that once we realize the energy part, the manipulation of the energy flow in a thermodynamic sense is essential to maintenance and inheritance of life, we also will understand that the relevance of other alternative information inheritance systems other than genetics in the process. And that's a point that is present in a lot of parts of the book, that it's kind of redeeming aspects of the now defunct Lamarckian approach to evolution and kind of finding the functioning moment in that Lamarckian space. Because for Lamarck, it's like, if you see like whatever giraffes like having certain long necks, it could be like a giraffe that was kind of slowly like stretching its neck, and like then it's just kind of through that stretching, like the neck went up, and that's how like giraffes like evolved to have long necks. But that's not how it works. Odling-Smee definitely agrees that that has a genetic story, but there are other things that like an individual organism can do in their limited lifespan that could change their evolutionary path. And it's not about stretching necks; it's about other things. This other thing is the umbrella term of that is niche construction. So there are parallel information inheritance systems that are introduced in Odling-Smee that are all evolutionary relevant. Okay, so for the rest of this episode, we're going to talk about three issues that we find with Odling-Smee's approach, again, in relationship with our interests in general. So there are going to be certain layers of his argument that we're not going to touch, not because we think is like great or not great, but because it's not the main part, like it's not part of the Versucha project. Remember that it's just like we have like a we go to different places. We go to places that people won't go. At this, there are not a lot of like people who work on niche construction and Odling-Smee and also talk about Hegel's logic. So we have like an overarching story here that if you're interested, you can watch uh, our other mini series that we have worked on. And in all of our critical engagements, those points are gonna come to the viewpoint. Now, for this one, let's talk about the three ones that we want to talk about now, and then there are going to be three more that we talk about in the next episode. And the first problem that we have with Odling-Smee's approach is over-inclusivity, meaning that the examples that Odling-Smee brings forth are of like what niche construction is are so expansive that it almost becomes rather meaningless to talk about niche construction. Because, for instance, photosynthesis, as I said before, is niche construction. Like a bacteria figuring out to use the solar energy for some process, that's niche construction. But like dam building also is niche construction. More than that, like if you are movement is niche construction, right? There's examples in the book that are like if you are like a specific species of worm, like if it goes to a certain like layer of soil, it can change the selection pressure on certain genes and have other selection pressures. The detail doesn't matter, but the point is that the solution that the worm puts forward is to move, but movement is also niche construction. So which takes us to a point of like what is not niche construction. Like it seems like that even breathing is niche construction, right? Like if photosynthesis is niche construction, I think breathing needs to be niche construction too. But what about like vision? Like having vision. Is that niche construction? Well, sure. Like if I have developed a way to manipulate the organization of light in the environment, I have altered the environment in the sense that it's now more suitable to. It takes away selection pressures that existed before, right? And like, of course, Aldous Smith cannot say that the requirement for niche construction is like consciousness, but he's talking about bacteria. So it's just like even like those very basic things that just happenstances that just happens in the biological universe. All of them are like niche construction. So it's just like it becomes rather uninspiring to talk about niche construction because everything has like been kind of flattened down to a degree that like you can say anything is niche construction, which might not be the problem with niche construction. It might be the problem of there is no typology of niche construction, which is going to be a problem that we are going to see again. Trent?
Yes, at this point, it just reminds me of like radical version of a karma theory in Buddhism that every action has a certain impact with sort of unknowable consequences, and that's how inclusive niche construction is. I don't think there is a single act of any individual organism that is not exercising certain type of enduring influence sort of like on its environment, which indirectly changes the selective pressures onto itself. But hence photosynthesis, breathing, and moving. Um, but as you mentioned, it seems like when he's writing, constructing this book, he's mostly having rather sophisticated multicellular animals in mind, stuff like beavers, stuff like animals. But on the other hand, he also talks about like bacteria, and he tried to find a common ground that includes all types of life form to provide a more comprehensive theory of life and its evolution. And in so doing, the term has at least the way I feel it, made me made it really difficult for me to find a point of focus. So what kind of action really constitute as a niche construction? What type of intention or purpose or cognitive capacity must be in place for this to be a significant parameter for us to evaluate the success both of individual organism as also as of a species that adapting and changing the environment. So yes, I'm 100% with you. Uh, the model, the concept for niche concept as they present in this book has been overly inclusive to the point I don't really know how to use it to concretely assessing the evolution trajectory of a species or an individual.
Yeah, and I think the and that's what I said, like about kind of returning to that issue is like the question is, does this mean that niche construction is irrelevant, or does this mean that we need a more nuanced understanding of the difference between niche constructions, like different, like that photosynthesis may be niche construction, but it's not dam building, and I don't think it's going to be enough to just say that, oh, dam building, requires, I don't know, a brain, but like, photosynthesis doesn't, because that is not telling me what is the difference between the niche that is constructed. It just tells me that the being that has created the niche is different, which is not very informative. And there is going to be a point later on that is going to make this even clearer. The second line of criticism is something that has it's a recurring theme in our conversation, in our conversations before, and I think one of the reasons that we were interested in niche construction was this idea of the unit of evaluation or unit of existence within the space. So to just put it turn it into a little bit more concrete, like both of us coming from humanities background, it is like the layer of it that is interesting for us is that when we want to frame society, right, or we want to understand the state and what are the constitutive parts of it, or what are the constitutive parts of society, it is very common that what we do is that we're just going to assume that there are like individuals there, and individuals are thrown into this empty space, empty in the sense that it's this other thing, not that it's empty physically, but it's empty other in the conceptual sense, and they're going to interact there, and something happens, or like that is what society is all about. Um, there is this kind of a very definitive unit that we come back to, and everything else is interaction between those units. Now, because niche construction is more on the side of maybe ecological thinking, and it's in fact more recognized as a standard in ecology that it is recognized in like biology in the very look at molecular biology, for instance. We were thinking that this might actually kind of disrupt the boundaries, right? Because when we're thinking about ecology, then it's in a lot of ways, ecology kind of gives you a context that reorganizes the what you thought are the entities within a space, right? Or it gives you a specific understanding of the environment. So I think one of our hopes was that this more ecological understanding is gonna give us tools to disrupt the basic ways that we cut nature, right? Not just like that there are like, there's not to deny that there is meaning in thinking about organisms as, you know, somehow coherent entities, but to radically change the way that we understand that. We are a little bit disappointed on that ground, however, because it seems to us that Odling-Smee is just basically going back to a very kind of a traditional, if that's the correct word, understanding of boundaries. There are individual organisms, they have internal coherence, they are individuals in the metaphysical sense, and they're thrown into different environments and they're interacting with that environment differently, right? But it seems to us that there is a potential for that bringing that kind of liveliness to the environment, and how it could encroach itself um, on the individual and vice versa, actually kind of taking it to the next level and like kind of revisiting how we're making these boundaries or how we're understanding these boundaries. How much of these boundary makings are about our purpose of understanding a specific function of an ecological niche? How much of it is about um, objective boundaries of those entities, right? And kind of bringing that a story, or like bringing uh, some ideas that could challenge that relationship. We don't see that challenge. We just see that, okay, they're individual organisms, this is their story, they have certain genes, and then they go to environments, they have adaptive issues, they solve them in a certain way and move forward. And by all means, maybe this modeling works to a good degree for specific problems that exist, as like the questions that are relevant to Odling-Smee, but niche construction theory, as it is um, proposed by Odling-Smee, doesn't seem to challenge anything about that problem of the unit. Trent.
Yes, I like the term. I like your focus, consistent focus, no matter what we're reading on the very basic categories that you assumed in the writer's analysis. That here's the unit, and the term really important for me is the organism environment niche relationship in his writing, and I think that givenness is assumed for both organism and for environment. So there, I don't know. I'm not like a trained as philosopher, but there is certain naive realism there. Like he goes into a wood, say, Odling-Smee walks into the wood, points at a bird, say, hey, here is a bird. That's an organism. And then point at a beaver, say, here's a beaver. That's another organism. And they coexist in the same environment, namely the wood. But the moment you really think carefully about the concept of niche construction and the importance, the agency of individual life history and individual behaviors, both stuff become really vague. For instance, you can look into the bird. You'll see it's not just one life; it has like a whole body of different bacteria, different like life forms that are in a symbiotic relationship with it. Are those like environments to the bird, or is it part of the bird? And vice versa, like is the bird's environment to those like bacteria, or is it part of the environment to that bacteria? Second is like, are the bird and the beaver really relating to the same environment? How do we draw the boundary of an environment? Like ecosystem, sometimes we use the energy as a way to talk about the balance like of transmission of an energy within a contained space. But are we really using physical space here, or are we using, say, that life forms like horizon, the kind of environment the species could exercise a certain type of purposeful influence on as its environment? So all those very, very it seems a very abstract philosophical concept, but I think are absolutely necessary for us to probe how empirically, um, how to say, accurate this niche construction theory can be, because you really need to set a boundary to both organism and environment in order to analyze that relationship and to compare whether that niche relationship is really important in the success of individual adaptation or species evolution. So that's my point.
I think that is a very good way to put it. It just a short follow up, because I think like Odling-Smee could just show up and say, hey, like, you know, we want to solve this problem, and in solving this problem, it makes sense to cut nature in this way, right? And as much as that is unsatisfying in the sense of like not telling us, like, what is the relationship between us framing the nature in this way and the reality of nature, in a more kind of a metaphysical question about like, maybe we have these problems, we cut the nature in this way, but then we should remember that the nature is not that way, really, right? And that will have many consequences if we really think about it that way, right? We can say that for solving this problem, we need to cut nature into organisms and environments, but in reality, there is no organism and there is no environment in this type of a boundary making that is needed for solving this problem. That will be fundamentally different from saying that no, there is something objective about organisms that is
Hmm.
true in nature, not just because we have this specific question from nature at this very moment, but because of a whole bunch of other reasons. Um, so that's one thing that, like, as much as that would have been unconvincing to me, for him to just say, here's like a more pragmatic like approach, he doesn't even say that. And that kind of reinforces what Trent called the kind of a naive realist. That of course, like here's a hand, and it's just like that's it. Here's a bird, and the problem with that also is just like, which is not just like, you know, this is not like a philosophical obsession. Like the part whole relationships really change the way we understand organisms. Like if the bacteria on the skin of the bird is, if it's not there, there is no bird, then what is that? Like how the framing of that becomes important if our goal is to understanding nature, right? Because we can say that, like, hey, again, for this other like pragmatic question, we say the bacteria is its own entity, the bird is its own entity, fine, right? But if there is an important thing, if in some ways the existence of that bacteria is far important for the coherence of that bird than like missing like an internal organ, which one is more constitutive of what a bird is? Like that is not just a obsessive question like that we just like throw around. Our understanding of what life is, those questions matter. That question of part and whole, and because the question of organism is ultimately the question of part and whole, is absolutely just forgotten. That is just like, okay, what we know what are the parts, what do we know what is the whole, then let's now see how the whole deals with the environment. And I think that is worse than the way that like someone like Dawkins would think about genes as units, because he's actually kind of like in some ways tries to get away from that naive realist image, right? Like it wants to say that, oh, it looks to you that the monkey is the unit, but it's true the monkey. That's not a coherent account. The coherent account is that like this is about these other layers. I don't think Odling-Smee gives us a good parallel story of why disrupting that naive realist view in the Dawkinsian way is wrong, because he never challenges that naive realist. image, actually. And I think the third point that we have here, the last point, the concluding point of this episode, is very much related to this. Because there is something very interesting in philosophy of biology. And this is not just about like a 20th century, 21st century problem. This happened starting from like, not even starting from Kant. I think it's Aristotle and all of that existed. But like someone like Kant was very much obsessed with this problem, which is we have the mechanistic view of nature, which now has evolved into like modern physics, right? Then maybe it's very much not like in accordance with Newtonian physics, but it has a specific structure. In that structure, um, allegedly at least, we do not need any concept that seems to be concepts that are very much just like used in human sciences. Purpose, right? Like you don't need to introduce the concept of purpose to understand what a black hole is, right? You can understand what a black hole is by just purely physical terminology, right? The symbolism is contained without introduction of like spooky concepts like intention, purpose, so on and so forth. There is this fundamental kind of problem that exists in biology that on the one hand it wants to replicate the physics, and on the other hand it cannot escape concepts like purpose, information, meaning, and mind, even in certain ways. Now, there are two basic like branches that I have encountered. One is that kind of an eliminative materialist approach, which says that ultimately these are folk concepts, right? We are using the concept purpose as a placeholder for something that we don't understand, right? So if we understand what are the biological relationships in like whatever like neurological relationships in multicellular brain having entities, then we understand that what we called purpose was these like 10 processes, and that's what that is. Purpose is not a thing that is just like outside all of these kind of physical and chemical interactions. Okay, so that's one approach. All of these are just kind of like garbage concepts imported from folk psychology and philosophy and these types of areas. Ultimately, at the end of science, biology will look like a lot more like physics than like sociology, right? It's basically the idea. The other approach is that no, there isn't no way to even define a biological entity without invoking the concept of purpose. Like, if we don't have the concept of purpose, we cannot contrast a self-maintaining system of like, whatever, a chemical formation of oil in a certain kind of temperature and environment that is maintained through time versus a living entity. We cannot do that, right? Unless you introduce concept of purpose, we cannot do that. However, that doesn't mean that the way that like philosophers talk about purpose is what we want to talk about. That doesn't mean that the way that like we in an everyday conversations we use the term purpose that's meaningful. No, those are kind of not. They still have the spookiness. We're going to naturalize these concepts. And I think Odling-Smee is part of this group, right? That like we're gonna use these concepts, we're gonna have them, but we're gonna naturalize them, right? But I don't think he does. Like I'm not sure how we really arrive at these concepts because like he talks about Claude Shannon's information theory and the thesis maze, which was like this kind of automated system maze that Shannon created for this obviously non-living entity called Theseus, and basically the goal of the experiments to show that with a specific structure embedded in that environment, this non-living mouse can learn how to navigate the maze in the most effective way. It can learn, it can gain information and reduce uncertainty and arrive at a goal without any sort of like mindedness being attached to the mouse. Now, Alding-Smee wants to say this is all great, but in biology or in the biological entities or in evolutionary sense, we need purpose, right? Like for Theseus and the maze, the goal was introduced by Shannon, but like for a real mouse, the purpose is internal. Why? How? Like that seems as spooky as it gets to me, especially if we are thinking about like entities that are not minded, like, or they're not minded in the way that I think Alding-Smee is willing to accept, like bacteria. Like, I think it takes a quite different type of an effort to show what it means to talk about purpose for bacteria, because bacteria doesn't have like a nervous system. So if you think to make sense of an activity of a bacterium, you need to introduce a concept of purpose. You need to be ready to create and defend a concept of purpose that does not require a nervous system. And I don't see that. And that's just another thing that just becomes kind of a, we just accept that we have these types of, purpose exist in biology, right? And this kind of like it's gonna like it kind of works both ways. In some ways, that he assumes that like the things that are like he kind of imports things from human version of things to the life of basic like entities, like basic living entities, and vice versa. So like meaning is like also applicable to bacteria, but then the meaning that human beings have also need to be kind of compatible with what bacteria has as meaning, but it's never clarified like how could you make sense of semantics in the basic sense without introducing all sorts of things that you don't seem to be prepared to introduce. How could you talk about purpose for bacteria without really introducing like how did you make this naturalized? I don't see that trend.
Yes, one is to kind of follow up on the point you mentioned, like the contrast between Theseus, that electric mouse, and a natural mouse. And I remember listening to a podcast somewhere that when automation, the kind of machine, was first introduced 17th, 18th century Europe, people were really scared because you could use that model to analyze all kinds of life. So for him, for Odling-Smee, there's a categorical difference between like a real mouse and like Theseus, because the real mouse has internal motivation and purpose, whereas the meaning and purpose and the goal were externally given. And that boundary is not, it seems to me, not physical in Odling-Smee's system. Instead, it's what make a mouse has an interiority is not his brain, but rather its mind. And that becomes very clear in the way he talks about how a bioorganism, the three steps involved in transmitting adaptive know-how or adaptive knowledge. I'll come to that today in a second. The first one is to detect causal relationship in the external world. And that seems to me, assuming that niche construction or non-genetically based to the inherited system presumes some mind-related entity in existence that constitutes a world system causal structure and use it to reduce complexity and to maintain that thermodynamic between the external and the internal. Here is like the perhaps physical in terms of energy related physical sense to system, but there is a jump between that mind and body subtly somewhere in the way he collapses this two categories, and the mind and brain. And the second thing is he uses knowledge and information sometimes separately as if they're two different things, because one is related to individual organisms' survival, adaptation, and evolution. The other is just the information out there with or without life. But some other times it seems to me he treats knowledge as a specific type of information, therefore, like managed by the same general theory of information Claude Shannon introduces. So there's no concept of epistemology here, as you mentioned, the semantics, the meaning, whereas that he makes such a jump very easily. I think that has direct connection with his, I don't know, deliberate avoidance talking about the brain-mind relationship, the one he is sometimes collecting knowledge and information into one category, sometimes separating them as if one is the subset of the another. Yes, that's my general observation, and I'm with you. I find his naturalization of spooky terms not convincing or successful. It seems like he's tried to get rid of them, but he really needs them. And those, at the end of it, do not seem to me, how to put it, natural category. Instead, those are like analytical categories they use introduced or superimposed by the theorist, and I do not see there in the very physical or biological activities trying to analyze to me.
Yeah, and I think it is also interesting that kind of by avoiding that, it is actually like, in a way, the avoidance of that has a different consequence that I think it also becomes clear in our conversation next in the next episode. But like, because one can say that the point about bacteria is not about purpose. Like bacteria is the point about bacteria is not about purpose. Purpose emerges at this level, right?
Mm,
Whatever that level is, right? I think, in a hypothetical scenario that is the theory, then you can kind of really be commit, instead of just using it by kind of analogy of like everything seems to be a little bit of a human being,
mm,
right? Of what we intuitively think about purpose, and it's just that's a fact of nature. Then you have to say that, okay, what we think about purpose, actually it is this thing that emerged because of so and so. Like it's
mm,
just like vision emerged at some point, but that's much harder work to do than just like assuming that, okay, bacteria purpose, mammals purpose, insects purpose. Maybe not. Like maybe that's not how we should frame that living being. So I think there is this point about like consistency that, the point about bacteria needs to be information in the same way that it is information for like a mammal. The purpose in bacteria also needs to play the same like logical role that it plays for like the monkey. And
mm,
it's not clear why we should have this consistency. Why can't we just think about like meaning as something that requires these 10 things that bacteria don't have? Why not thinking about purpose as something that is emerging at this, as this specific point? And I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm saying that if you're not making a point of why it is not the case that that's it, and you simply just assume life comes with a package of purpose, and we just like say that that's naturalized, that's not going to do it. That's not going to actually naturalize anything. They're just kind of, it's just the conceptual responsibility is not taken. And I think that is something very important. All right, I think we can conclude this round of discussing the issues. we're going to be back very soon with the second round.
Yes, stay tuned. Our next round of critical remarks with Odling-Smee's niche construction is coming up.